Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the LSA's webinar on the writing process. My name is David Robinson. I am the LSA's Director of Membership and Meetings, and we'll just wait a few more minutes to allow the rest of our attendees to log in, and then we'll get started. So please sit tight for a few minutes, and we'll get going in just a few.
Yeah, that's feature thing too. Yeah, this is ours.
Okay, thank you everyone for waiting. Welcome to the LSA's webinar on the writing process. My name is David Robinson. I'm the Director of Membership and Meetings for the Linguistics Society of America, which is sponsoring this webinar. While I'm talking, you'll be seeing a brief slideshow about the LSA and what we do. And on the final slide, you'll see information about a special membership discount for participants in this webinar. We're excited to present this webinar on the writing process as a service to our members and to the linguistics community at large, and we're very grateful to our panelists. I'm especially pleased that we were able to secure the participation of two scholars whose writing has won awards. Sharese King is a postdoc at the University of Chicago and the co-author with John Rickford of Language and Linguistics on the Trial, Hearing Rachel Jeantel and Other Vernacular Speakers in the Courtroom and Beyond, which appeared in the December 2016 issue of Language and won that year's Best Paper in Language award. Charles Yang is Professor of Linguistics at the University of Pennsylvania and is the author of The Price of Linguistic Productivity, How Children Learn to Break the Rules of Language, published by the MIT Press in 2016. And that book won our 2017 Leonard Bloomfield Book Award. I'd like to take a few moments now to let you know how the webinar will work and to make sure that you're familiar with the GoToWebinar control panel. So first of all, you will see a handouts widget on your control panel. We put copies in there of the panelists' slides, and you can download them at any time during the webinar. We'll also have them available on the LSA website, probably later today, possibly early next week. You may have also noticed that your microphones are muted. This is so we don't get background noise like dogs barking and traffic and babies and from all of the participants. So when it comes time for the question and answer, you can use the questions widget on your GoToWebinar dashboard to ask your questions. And if your question is for a specific panelist, please let me know which one. Finally, I would like to run a very quick poll to help our panelists gauge your experience with the writing process. I'll start the poll in just a moment, and please take a minute to fill it out, and I will display the results so that everyone can see them. So I'm launching the poll now. And if you can go ahead and take a moment to vote. It looks like most of you have voted. We'll keep the poll open just a few more seconds, then we'll go ahead and close it, and I will share the results with everyone. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll, and let's see, now I can share the results with you. So you can see a good half of the people who answered have not published anything yet, so that's a good guide for our panelists. 16% of you have published shorter items such as reviews, squibs, blurbs, and so forth. 26% of you have published articles, 6% chapters in edited volumes, and just 3% have published books. So thanks for taking the poll, and I'm going to go ahead and turn the floor over now to Sharese King, who will be the first of our panelists. Each of them will discuss their experience with the writing process, sharing their tips and best practices, and they will be available later on in the webinar to answer your questions. So we'll turn the floor over to Therese, and here you go, Sharese.
Okay, thank you.
I'm sorry, I think I need to close the poll first. Sorry about that. Here we go. All right, there you go.
Okay, great. Thank you. Can everyone see my slides?
No, not yet for some reason.
Okay, let's see. What about now?
Not yet. I'm going to try it again. How about now? Okay.
Okay.
I'm still not seeing it. Well, Sharese, I have a copy on my desk. Oh, there you go.
Okay, great, great. All right, thank you everyone who is tuning in and getting our tips and advice. I'm just going to jump right in. So first, I want to start off by talking about the position from which I'm writing, because my advice will be very much so colored by the fact that I am particularly a Provost postdoc, which means I don't have a large teaching load. I teach one course per year for the 2-year term. And so what that means for me is that I have lots of unstructured writing time. So the tips I'm going to be giving you today are really going to be related to how I manage to structure that time. And also about who is in sort of my network as a kind of accountability partner for me. So I was hired in a cohort, both within my department and across departments. And again, this will become important later when I start to talk about, finding your community of people to write with. Additionally, I am at a private R1 institution, which values research first and foremost. So that is also going to influence some of my advice that I have for you all. And in thinking about that, I want you to be taking a second and stopping to think, what is the position that I am writing from, right? And how does your position affect where you can publish? So, for example, what is your target journal? What kinds of text do you want to publish, right? Is it going to be more of an article-based or a book-based field? Like those are some of the questions you should be asking yourself. And then what do you have to say, right? And so on to the point of what you have to say, I think that's going to be the part that comes when you think more about the ideas, right? And so what I like to do generally is keep an idea journal. And I did this especially during my dissertation process in order to see the evolution of my thoughts. I think it's a really great mindfulness exercise, as well as to sort of go back to my original ideas when I sort of get stuck or lost, right? So keeping an idea journal, I think, is very useful. You should think about also organizing those ideas or potential paper submissions in an Excel spreadsheet. And I'll show you an example of that in a second. But when you organize those ideas, you should be considering what each paper is going to contribute to your larger research agenda. And this is especially important for junior faculty who are on the tenure track line. You really want to be considerate of the ways in which what you're going to say contributes to the larger sort of agenda you have for your entire research program. And I think this is an example of that. Yeah, so for me, I'd have just put some potential paper ideas, some of which I've submitted, some of which I haven't, and I put examples of target journals, some of which I have actually not submitted to, some of which I have. And when sort of I want to submit that, as well as whether or not it will be co-authored or just a solo submission, as well as the status. Have I sent it out? Is it in prep? Those are all that kind of information I keep sort of in this Excel spreadsheet. And eventually it's going to be useful because when you go back to write, for example, your research statements for things like renewal, you'll have sort of a log of what you've done, and you'll be able to think more cohesively about how it all builds up into, again, this larger research plan. So I've put in parentheses my co-author and co-advisor's name, Jonathan Rickford, and I put this on here because these were some bits of advice that he actually gave me during my time as a Stanford student, as well as in an email when I asked what are some things that he thinks people should know. So among them are, be clear about the theoretical issues that you're addressing. And so when you're thinking about, okay, what do I want to write? You should be thinking about who is your audience, right? And where do you want to situate yourself in the field? And when you answer those questions, I think it will become a lot clearer of the target journals that you have in mind. And in particular, if you're like, well, I'm not quite sure exactly what are those target journals, one of the things you can do is look at the articles in which you sort of want to engage or in which you like that person's work and see where they've been published or where that person has published. And that will sort of give you an idea of, okay, well, this journal typically likes this kind of work. And what's nice about that is when you go and locate the journal, they already provide for you on their website the kinds of pieces, right, they like to solicit, and it'll give you sort of a review of their goals as well as their policies. And you can try to look over all of that information, as well as use their guidelines to sort of model your paper based on. A lot of times, I think, sometimes we don't know until the full analysis is done where we want to send it. But if you do know in advance, I think it saves a lot of time if you look at their guidelines and start to write the paper sort of within that structure from the beginning. Additionally, I think that outlining the paper is so important. It's really essential. When John and I were writing our paper, we made sure to plan out the sections and the subsections of the paper, as well as to estimate the number of pages for each section. And this counts as sort of a guide for you to think about how much should I be saying about this particular thing? And a step further that I like to do in my own work is to think about the citations, right? Whose work am I going to be discussing in relation to this larger point or this larger subsection that I'm trying to discuss? So definitely write out an outline that lists the sections and subsections. And if you're a little more detailed like I am, include the citations, right? Where you want to be referencing particular authors' work within the text. So the writing process, what does that actually include? Well, for me, that includes anything from ideation all the way to the editing process. And so when you think about how to organize your time, around writing, I think there are a few different pieces of advice that I've gotten. I'll tell you a little bit more about where I've gotten it from in a second, but I want to share this with you because I think it's especially important. So for one, I think you should try to plan out a semester or quarterly goal. I've been on quarter systems both at Stanford and now at the University of Chicago, so that's sort of what I'll be referencing if you hear me say quarter. So particularly for my quarter, maybe I'll say something like, well, I want to draft up a rough draft of this particular talk that I've given. Or maybe I'll say, well, I want to do the analyses for this paper this quarter, right? Set some sort of quarterly goal for yourself. And then you want to go through and think about per week, what kind of progress do you need to make in order to achieve that quarter goal, right? So if I am saying, I want to finish all of my analyses, what does it take for me to get there? Maybe I'm transcribing this amount of data first, and then I'm going to force align these texts, and then I'm going to go through and run these kinds of scripts, right? I'll be breaking down across the weeks what kind of goals that I have in order to reach this larger semester or quarterly goal, right? And I also hold a weekly planning meeting, and that for me is especially important because I include on there all of the activities that I just need to do, both as a researcher, as a teacher, mentor, any of those things, and sort of map out every day, what do I want to work on, right? And so again, you see me going from these really large chunks to these smaller digestible chunks in order to get at these larger goals, right? And so for me, I've actually been working on developing a daily writing habit. And what that means is pretty much I try to write every day for at least 30 minutes. And some days it might look like 2 hours. Some days it might look more like 15 minutes, but I try to commit to the process of writing every day. And the benefit of that is first, I can more easily jump back into my work, I find, when I'm working on it consistently. Sometimes if I only work on something once a week, it takes a little longer for me to get started, to remember where I was at, to remember what idea I left off on. So I like the process of writing a little bit every day for that reason, as well as if I have to miss a day, right? It doesn't make a huge difference to my sort of overall quarterly goal, right? Because I've been working more consistently on this. So if something, an emergency comes up and I can't write that day, I don't feel that sort of guilt maybe that some people associate with not being able to meet their goals. So accountability groups, these are so essential for me. As I mentioned earlier, so I was hired in a cluster both within and then across departments. And the people who I write with are the people in the Provost postdoc program, as well as I have some friends who are not at the university who I write with. And I'll talk about the different ways that that can look. So if you're writing in person, it might be that we meet at a particular place once a week or twice a week, and we write for a certain amount of time. Sometimes we can write for 3 hours, and we'll split it up into pomodoros, which is just a writing segment. So maybe we'll write for 50 minutes, take a 10-minute break, and we'll sort of come together and talk about where we're having issues or what we were able to accomplish or what we hope to finish by the end of that writing session, and then hop back into the writing process for another 50 minutes. And you can adjust this as you need to, but it's nice to sort of, again, have this accountability group with of people for you to like bounce ideas off of and just build, I guess, collegiality, I guess is the word. But that's one mechanism you can use. The other one is online. So sometimes you may not want to leave your apartment to write. You have an office in your space or a particular desk or something that you prefer to write at, but you still want an accountability buddy. And you can establish that through an online connection and just Skype your friend who maybe wants to write at the same time. You talk for a little bit about your writing goals and then put your laptop on mute, and the both of you write for a segment, come back to Skype to discuss maybe what you've done in that segment, and then go back into writing. So you can set this up sort of in the way that is most convenient for you, but I think it's generally really good to have an accountability buddy if you have especially deadlines you need to meet for getting work out. Now, the National Center for Faculty Development and Diversity, you've probably heard of this. It's really popular. It's a really great resource for learning different skills around writing, as well as managing your emotions even around writing. So I put the website there, and there are going to be some colleges and universities for which they have a membership, particularly with this website. And what that means is that you get access to some of their free programs, like the 14-day writing challenges they have, where you challenge yourself to write every day again for 30 minutes, or the webinars, right, in which they have on different aspects of the writing system. Particularly, I am in the Faculty Success Program. This program is not free, and it costs about a few $1,000s, and you can maybe use your research funds to fund that if you're at a place that provides that. But there's also a template that they provide online to ask for those funds from your university. Particularly, some of us were able to get it from the Provost office here, and we were able to also pair some of our research funds to be able to do this sort of what they call a boot camp for faculty. And it's a 12-week program, and each week you do a new exercise that helps you with your writing process, and you have an accountability group through that program. And again, you just commit to trying to write every weekday, right? Monday through Friday for 30 minutes. Okay, and the last bit of advice I'm going to give is on the workshopping process, and that is just making sure that you commit to the process of getting feedback, I think, early on. And so this could happen a lot of different ways. I think one of my favorite ways is, of course, conferencing. That is a way for me through a slideshow, or maybe for you through a handout, to sort of get a set of ideas drafted together and a space for me to get feedback on it. And from that feedback, I can then sort of use that to fuel this first draft of a paper. So I really like conferencing for that reason. But at different institutions, they may have workshops. I actually just gave a workshop talk in the semiotics workshop in the anthropology department. And I was able to share a draft of a paper that I'm getting ready to submit and get feedback directly on that particular draft from the attendees. There are also different kinds of working groups. Maybe you have a semantics pragmatics group, maybe you have a sociolinguistics working lunch or something like that, and that might be a space to get ideas. And then additionally, like, you want to make sure you have colleagues with whom you can share drafts at different stages. So I have some colleagues for whom I call them when I'm doing my ideation, right? I'm like, I have this idea, I want to just kind of bounce it off of you just to see maybe where I can locate this question in relation to within the field, right? Who's been answering these kinds of questions. But I also have colleagues for whom I send them a first draft, right? And then I have colleagues or advisors for whom I send them a later stage of the work. And so really thinking about your network in that kind of way is useful, and being willing to offer up yourself as a person who is able to exchange or read drafts will help in sort of building that community. And lastly, I have some advice on comments from referees. This is past the point when you've already submitted a piece of work. John Rickards says, don't be discouraged. And that is really valid advice. Sometimes we can be a bit attached or sensitive about our work, and it isn't the easiest for us to hear feedback at a certain stage in that process. And so if you're one of those people, then sometimes you can send it to a colleague to look at and walk through the comments and sort of give you a gist of what's being said. And then once you sort of detach from the work a bit, you can go back through, organize the comments, and think about them in terms of, okay, is this more of a substantial change to the draft in terms of redoing some sort of analyses, or are these just, text edits or changing a figure here and there? So organize your comments to help you with the editing of the paper. And remember that all of the comments that are provided, you don't necessarily have to integrate into the draft. And so if there are certain things to push back on, then you can do so in the cover letter to the editor. But remember that, your colleagues and your peers are trying to make this the best work possible. So they really have the paper's best interest in mind. And those are my ideas for now, but I'm happy to answer more questions in the Q&A, and I'll turn it over to my colleague, Charles.
Hi, can you see me and hear me?
Yes, we can.
Can you see the slides as well?
Yes.
Good. Well, thanks for having me here. I'm in the game a little bit longer. I only wish we had such support sessions when I was starting out. So I'm going to share with you is, first of all, writing is very hard. It's really hard labor. It doesn't matter how many papers or books you have written. It will remain so. So one of the things I felt that can somehow dull the pain, if you will, is to, and also possibly make it a more effective writing experience as well as a product, is to think about writing as telling a story. So what I'm going to say is, of course, highly idiosyncratic. These are just bits and pieces I somehow implicitly gathered over the years, as really after having to do the webinar that enabled me to think through this process and try to put them in words. Okay, so I'll start with that. And I'll start with you have to, when you write something, could be a paper, could be a book, you have to have a story. And of course, how you tell the story and how you write about the story can only be as good as your story, right? So in other words, the research has to be there, the idea has to be there. So what I'm going to talk about today is simply how to convey those ideas better in writing, okay? I was influenced by several people over the years. Again, these connections were not clear when I first heard those advice, but now it becomes more clear down the road. The first thing was a legendary professor of computer science at MIT when I was in graduate school. His name is Patrick Winston. Sadly, he passed away earlier this year. He was known for being a great teacher. I think his videos for AI is among the most watched videos online. And every year he would give a lecture on how to give talks. So you can, if you scan the QR code, you should be able to go to one of the web pages where someone sort of narrated how Patrick was telling people how to give an effective talk. And in it, Patrick just talked about a good talk has to have a story. You have to build up the story in pieces. You have to somehow build up the suspense and leading your audience to pay attention. And so in the end, the story and the theory you're trying to propose becomes almost natural. Of course, if you go there, you see some of the differences between giving a talk versus writing. But I think some of the messages and the logic applies in both cases. So this is really for your homework to go back and see what a very good writer and very good speaker had been able to distill his wisdom for us over the years. The other thing is, you may wonder why, we write a technical paper, we're not telling the story. So in what way can we use a story analogy to talk about writing scientific papers? So here I would point you to another great example. This is Thornton was one of the greatest mathematicians of the 20th century, and he wrote a paper kind of later in his career talking about what do people do in mathematics, right? So when you think about math, you think about proofs. So there should be cut and dry, formal. What has writing to do with it? But in this paper, Thornton talks about how mathematics first about proof, developing proof, but I think he was saying the more maybe a more elevated goal is to convey ideas of how to understand the subject better. Okay, so even for something as cut and dry as mathematics can be written in different ways. A great mathematician not only having the great ideas, but will also be able to convey their ideas in the logically most flowing way, so that so the readers would understand why this mathematician did what they did. Okay, such that their ideas would be more influential, and that would impact future generations of mathematical research. That's clearly the case with William Sumston, and I think that's something we can absorb and adapt in our business as well. Having said that, if you think about writing as having to tell a story, and storytelling is presumably more interesting than writing a technical paper. So here I also, over the years, have come up with a couple of tricks. Okay, the first trick is that you want to rehearse your story in your head many times over before you write even a single word. This was not clear to me early on. I would start writing and then I'll get stuck and go back to change this word, to change that word. It ended up being time wasting, but also not very effective. So over the years, I've got some opportunities to give lectures. Would talk about ideas before I really wrote the thing, right? So I would find myself try to come up with a narrative, try to come up with a story before I would go to a place to give a lecture, as very often when I was going for a run and so on. So you have to get yourself excited about the story you're telling, and then you can gradually refine the script. Once the flow of the story is clear in your head, I think that's when writing begins. This is almost like you have to do all the thinking before you write on a single word. This is what I said. Once you think about writing a storytelling, you must have a narrative. You must be able to build suspense. It's also interesting to have what Patrick Winston called near misses. Namely, these could be your own previous attempts to solve a problem, and that didn't quite work out. This could be the previous scholar's attempt to solve a problem, but also didn't quite work out. Then gradually you lead the reader to this big reveal, which is your theory, of course, then the rest would hopefully follow. So that's another tip I've found particularly useful over the years. And also, you have to give any story would have to have a strong ending. So here I quote from Morris Halley, who told me more than once, in the end, you have to give him a zinger. Okay, this is of course the character of someone who's an excellent storyteller, and that certainly was Morris Halley. Well, the other thing I've been frequently asked about is whether we should be writing books or papers, or what kind of audience you are engaging with. So I would say you have to write a book if it's a very long story, or the plot is very elaborate, then lots of moving pieces. And also, in some cases, maybe if the idea is sufficiently novel and you certainly would have trouble getting probably getting a paper accepted at a journal, and that's probably the time to write a book. And very often, of course, this is a question that depends on the nature of your field. Some subfields value books more than papers. For some other subfields, it's virtually impossible to write a book at an early stage of your career. So it's really, this is entirely up to you and up to your institution, up to the kind of goals you have in mind as to whether you should write a book or papers. When I was starting out, I got advice from Steve Anderson. This was at Yale. Steve told me, and he's right, that is, for the most part, books are more influential than papers. This is probably 20 years ago, so things might have changed, and possibly because books are likely to be more theoretical, and theoretical ideas generally have had more impact over the years, right? So this is really, again, it's a trade-off. Really depends on what kind of work your field and your institution values. And that should play a role in deciding, for you to decide whether you should be writing a book or papers. And also one of the things I've seen, certainly working with students, and is to see students or younger people putting everything they know about a topic into a paper. And so that, if you think about it, is not effective. It's not an effective way to tell a story. If you have a story, I think you'll feel lucky if you could get one message across, and certainly it's not possible to get multiple messages across. So especially in the early days of writing, I really think it's nice to think very hard to distill the core message into a very, very clean line, and then go from there. Finally, I think this is certainly a personal experience. I didn't come from linguistics. I came from computer science, so I was always a bit of outsider. And so as a result, when I came into linguistics, I kind of didn't know what I was doing, but I was attracted to the ideas that I could easily relate to, right? So I think this may not be a bad piece of advice, because when you're doing your work, you should always think about how your work is situated in a broader context. This could be how your particular topic, say in theoretical syntax, relates to, I don't know, A-bar syntax in general. It could also mean that how you see the role of linguistics in connecting to other disciplines, right? So to do this, I think to do this effectively, you must talk to people outside of your area, outside of your field. This is very important. I mean, certainly, of course, talking to people from outside your area can frequently bring insights that can help you do your own work better. But this will also help you to explain to other people why your work matters. And you have to learn how to explain it in the most accessible way, and also the process of how to unpack a very complex idea in layers. So it's possible that when in the final layer, not a lot of people will be able to understand it, but they should understand the steps leading to it. You should also appreciate the logic that leads you from the outer layer to the inner layers. So here, going back to what Patrick Winston's advice on how to give talks, especially job talks, is that you want to make sure that 80% of your audience understand 18% of your story. So this is something I think is important, that as a field of linguistics becoming more and more specialized, you really need to engage beyond your own box, and that's and I think keep talking to people outside of your narrow focus would be incredibly effectively for doing so, not only to improve your work, but also make the writing process easier, because again, once again, you're trying to tell a story that's appealing to people, especially to people outside of your narrow core. And finally, I think it's important to have role models. There are many, many good writers in linguistics, and also, of course, outside of linguistics. And I don't remember when was the first time I started consciously following this. But if what I'm saying is sensible at all, how we can improve as the writers in linguistics should benefit from experiences outside of linguistics, right? So I think it's very important to read outside of linguistics. For instance, I find very instructive to look at high quality literary magazines. And nothing to do with linguistics, but you can see how good nonfiction writing is done. It's also, you find there's actually a lot of similarities between good fiction and also good nonfiction. So it's all about storytelling. So this could give you another excuse to read for fun. But try to see the logical structure that goes behind good storytelling in both nonfiction and also of course fiction. I have had the pleasure of working with some professional editors, and they really know what they're talking about. So if you have friends who are working publishing, who are working editing, just talk to them, show them something that they may not understand the technical materials, but they can probably give you good advice on how to structure an argument in a most cogent way. And finally, you should try to read some good linguistic writings. So here I'm giving you some examples, right? So they are certainly very good writers, and they're also very influential linguists. So I named these because you probably have to read them at some point of your linguistic career anyway. So for me, at least there are three linguists whose writing can serve as models. One is Noam Chomsky, especially his early writings when he tried to set the agenda for gendered grammar. His writing has a level of clarity and forceful authority that's rarely seen in any discipline, and by which I do not mean, by which I mean that he was very clear about what he said. He didn't hedge, he didn't apologize, and that's something I think we should all try to do, is to be honest with our work and how our work clearly relates to other work, and sometimes we have to spell this out ourselves, because that's the most effective way of communicating ideas across. The other one was Maurice Halley. Maurice, maybe because his first language was in English, he wrote in a very almost a plain and accessible way, but always very persuasive. And so some of his writings could be read by anyone, including undergraduates with no linguistics background. They can still know what he was going after. And also his writing was style and certain materials very wide-ranging, drawing from disciplines outside of linguistics. And also, of course, he has lots of zingers in his papers. And finally, I would add Bill LeBeau, my colleague. Bill, of course, studies narratives, right? So, and Bill's work, in particular, say his 3 volumes of Principles of Linguistic Change, draws from a vast amount of materials, from historical linguistics, of course, to sociolinguistic, to biology, to psychology, and to the history of ideas. And he was able to very effectively, in my view, structure a very long story around a central narrative. So by the time you are done with the books, you feel like you've learned so much, but you never lost his train of thought. And so these are some of the examples, role models I've certainly looked up to, and they are, of course, some of the founding figures of our field. And so you can find lots of useful information from their writing in addition to their linguistics. And finally, I would say, if you're telling a story, you have to love it. You have to tell it with passion. So here's a recent piece in the New York Times: "Your job will never love you back." Well, our job is a privilege, and we're doing linguistic science, and this is and sometimes getting paid to do so. That's really excellent. But this is another way of seeing this, is that this is going to be hard work, and we're obviously not in this for the fame or money. So you really have to become attached to it. You really have to become advocate for your own ideas, and that's probably what I have to say for now. And these are some of the, I wouldn't call them tips, it's certainly simply personal experiences I personally find useful to myself, and hope they'll be useful to you as well. Now back to David, I suppose.
Great, thank you very much. And a moment. So thank you very much to our panelists, and we are ready now for the question and answer portion of the program. So again, you will see a questions widget on your GoToWebinar dashboard. That's where you'll ask your questions, and if the question is for a specific panelist, please let us know which one. So go ahead and submit your questions now. We do have one actually already, and it's the following. It's for either panelist. On a publication with multiple authors, how do you decide on the order of the authors?
Please, yeah.
Okay, so I can respond to that. That's that can require, I think, various kinds of responses. And for one, it's going to be based on how your co-authors view co-authorship. If, for example, you're in a lab, it might be such that if you're using the resources of a particular kind of lab, then the person who runs that lab is always a co-author on that work, right? But if it is a kind of situation in which you are not, I think you need to negotiate at the top of writing a paper with your co-author what should be your ordering of things. If it's going to be something that you both are contributing to equally, then I would say sometimes people choose alphabetical and they put on their CV an asterisk to denote, guess what, this was an equal contribution from either author. If it is such the case that one person is doing more of the labor by way of ideas and data analysis, then perhaps that person's name will go first before everyone else's. But those are a few immediate thoughts.
Right. Well, I have little to add other than maybe some suggestions on finding the right co-authors. And I found I collaborated with lots of people. Some collaborations were very smooth, some collaborations were harder. And I've certainly found that it's helpful to be working with someone that's more disciplined than yourself, when it comes to the writing process. And some of, so for instance, I think Sharese and I will make a great team
Yes.
because you need someone to have a schedule, to have a list of agenda that both of you or all of you should contribute to. And sometimes you really need a taskmaster of some sort. And so I would say choose your co-authors carefully. You don't want to get someone who's even less disciplined than yourself. And then as of the author order, I've thought about this over the years, and it's interesting. So I've always found a principle of the following being relevant, namely the principle of substitutability. Okay, so it could be a paper, it could be a project. If you were, let's say, if you're working with undergraduate RAs who did some work, you ask yourself, should this person be on the paper? And if so, in what order? You ask yourself, is this person's effort easily replaceable? Okay, so for instance, if you have a undergraduate RA, chances are, for some clerical data work, chances are that person is substitutable. Then you may not necessarily want to. You certainly don't need to have that person on the paper. In some cases, it could be someone walking down the hall and said, "Well, you should do this," and you did that, and that became a paper. You feel like that person should be a co-author, even though that person didn't add a word to the writing, because that person contributed a crucial idea. So when it comes to the ordering of authorship, I also think I agree with Therese. You really have to see who did what contribution. But usually in a team, people have some idea of who did what. And in some cases, I think probably in all cases, it's best to be upfront about it, to be completely transparent about it. And I think that's a good principle to follow in all such cases.
Great. And here's another related question. I don't really know if you've covered it yet, but if you have anything to add, you can. How do you keep each other accountable when co-authoring a paper?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think this is going to go back to the planning portion of the paper, for one, and making sure like you clearly articulate who is responsible for what. When you're writing the paper, maybe it might be I'm responsible for the introduction and the discussion, and this other person it's more so their wheelhouse in terms of the methodology, so they're going to write up that section of the paper. And so just I think first of all, making clear what each other's roles are in writing the paper is important. But also, again, if you have a set deadline together, so you make this maybe this quarterly sort of goal for yourself, and if you kind of maybe share that calendar with each other, like by this date we want to have this generated, and maybe by this date we'll want to send it off. I think that's another way of building in accountability. And yeah, just checking in with your co-author to make sure both of you can still devote the same amount of time and resources to something. Because for me, again, I am in a postdoc position. I have a lot of free writing time, but like my co-author has just begun their assistant professorship. And so they're getting acclimated to that entire process, teaching a lot more. And so sometimes there are some other things that maybe I'll pick up on my end. Maybe it's, okay, I'll be responsible for checking the references or formatting the paper, things like that. I think it's just communication, first and foremost, is going to be really important when you're trying to hold people accountable.
Okay, we have another question for both panelists. What are your drafting practices? How many times do you think it's necessary to really massage a work into being what you intended?
Okay. Yeah, so it's just going to vary. So I have, for me, a lot of the drafting processes, I think, involve the thinking about the paper. So Charles, your advice about sort of developing the narrative, that's super important for me. And that happens in the idea stage, in which I write down the first iteration, but then maybe read something or think more about another issue, and then sort of write it in relation to what I first wrote about it. And like that sort of iterative process of thinking about writing is super important before we feel like we need to first create a draft. Because I think part of the issue in drafting has to do with, part of the issue in like it taking so long to draft something has to do with we're thinking while we're writing, right? And sometimes that's great, but sometimes it's like you actually don't have to be writing at all. You can just take the time to step back and say, actually, what is it that I'm trying to contribute? And how does this affect this? Thinking about your counter arguments, right? And addressing those in the text. I think the thinking process for me is super important. And I think part of how I know a work is ready is going to come for me in part from the feedback I get from my colleagues. So if I've sent someone something maybe twice or 3 times and they're like, I think that this is ready now to send out, I'll take their word for it. But everything is not going to require the same amount of drafts. And I want us to be very careful about treating each piece as if they're the same, because some require maybe more thinking about the theory than others. Maybe a paper is just a methodological contribution. I use this new method to do this, right? And that's just a retelling of something. But there are other papers for which it's like, no, I'm actually considering what is race and what's its relationship to place, for example, in my work. And that's going to take a lot more thinking about the nature of identity work and a lot more reading of other texts before I can start to put down to page what I think about this idea.
Yeah, I agree with that. I would, if anything, I need to add is that don't over tweak it. Sometimes you do hit the point of diminishing returns, and that's something I have to remind myself all the time, even though I'm probably better at reminding the students I advise. This is time to stop tweaking and send it out. And so just watch out for it. And so don't over add it either.
Okay, here's another question which I think could be on for both of you. Should one multitask, that is, work on 2 papers or a book and a paper at the same time?
Absolutely. I think that one should multitask. Of course, it also is going to depend on what other kinds of responsibilities you have in your position, but multitasking doesn't have to look like writing 2 separate things at the same time. It could look like collecting data for one paper while writing up another paper. right? It doesn't necessarily have to be the same kind of task, research task. So yeah, I like that, as well as sometimes if I am writing two things at the same time, it is nice if I get tired, because I've developed more of a daily writing habit. It is nice to be able to switch off to something else if I kind of am in a rut with one project.
Right, I agree with that. And we are, your writing is never going to be always smooth sailing. There's going to be a point where we get stuck. And this is probably a good idea to switch to something else. This is also, again, words of wisdom passed on from our predecessors and pioneers. So Arvind Joshi used to tell people you should always be working on two projects, not just two papers, because you can never predict how well one project is going. In case you are stalled, you should have something else to work on. And so I think the same lesson applies here to not only to research, but also to writing.
Okay, here's a question for you, Charles.
Yeah.
Was the series you mentioned Principles of Linguistic Change?
Yes. Yeah. This is, you mean Bill Abov's books? Yes. Principles, the 3 volumes. Yeah. And they are right. They came out in over a span of, I think, 15 years or so. And and I think that should be required reading for everybody.
Okay, and here is another question. I think it's for both of you. It's obviously going to have very different answers. How has your writing changed across different stages of your career?
Yeah. So my career is short in comparison. So I guess I'll talk about it in terms of grad school versus now as a postdoc. I think my writing is a lot more intentional. And that, what I mean by that is, in graduate school, it was about writing when I was inspired, writing in spurts, and sort of thinking about writing in this kind of way that wasn't super focused on that weekly goal that I kind of have told you about now, whereas now it's a lot more organized. I have more structure about what it is I want to be writing at the moment. And yeah, I think that's like the biggest change, is that I've used my postdoc time to sort of cultivate the structuring of my writing practice, because it is a practice.
I definitely agree with that, and found myself to be more intentional and also more selective, right? Again, it sort of depends on the stage of a career. When graduate, you're happy to get anything published. When you're starting out, of course, almost the more the merrier, but it's not always the case. And sometimes, the committees, they're not stupid. They know what the quality of each paper. They know when it's just quantity, when it's actually quality. But also, you could be doing a friend a favor, contributing to something. Very often, whenever you write a paper, it's a draining process. It takes something out of you, right? So that means that you're devoting energy to things that you may not devote to something else that may be more worthwhile. So I think I found myself over the years to become a little more selective in what to write, and also there's also a sense where sometimes you don't want to move on from a topic and try something new, right? So that's so that's probably comes with maturity and so on. But I really found that's a change for in my writing over the years. And also looking back, some of the things I wrote, I don't know, 20 years ago, I can see I've matured, and so that's not a bad thing either.
Okay, here's another question. How do we decide how much to assume the audience knows about methodology, theory, etc.? This is especially an issue for me in methodology, background, and theoretical implications.
That's a great question. I like to err on the side of not assuming much. I like to describe yeah, a lot of the process from scratch. And if there's something that you think should be sort of foregrounded, as in like people should know, maybe put a citation to like sort of link to where people can sort of find that out. But I think it's better when reviews come back and an editor maybe says it's too much versus this is not enough, we don't quite understand. So I like to err on the side of not assuming that my audience will know a lot in terms of methodology, and rather pull back than to feel like I need to go back and re-explain this.
I feel similarly. I feel this is this experience you gain by talking to people outside of your technical field. So if you talk to enough of them, you get a sense of what's the typical expectation of someone, say, in psycholinguistics or someone in historical linguistics. So that's you can get a sense of how much of the let's say the transitional background you need to introduce in the paper. But also, I think there's also the flip side of the coin, namely, sometimes when you write for a slightly different discipline, you don't need to give all the details that are unnecessary. Very often you may write a paper, they don't need to know your theory of X, Y, or Z. They just need to know a generalization. So that's also a skill that I think that really takes practice. It takes practice of talking to people over the years to get a sense of what's the appropriate level of meeting somewhere in the middle. And I would certainly encourage everyone to practice this skill with people that are somewhat that are in different fields.
Here's a really good question. What is your preferred strategy about how to proceed when you're stuck?
Yeah, for me, I would say I usually take a step back and read more. Usually when I get stuck, it's because there's something I don't understand or I don't have the language to explain. And so sometimes, again, just going back and looking at other people's works sometimes gives me like the language to be able to talk about something. Yeah, I would say I take a step back for a second. And this is a good time to even turn to the other project that you may have in the wings, right? And sort of give yourself space from that, because sometimes your work on another project can inform another thing that you're currently working on. So that's my approach.
I agree. When you're stuck, I would move on to something else and but save it. And sometimes you'll come back a day, a week, or even a month, or even a year later. You see, what was I thinking? And then you would probably chop off what you wrote, maybe save it somewhere else for some later writing, and then start afresh with a new set of eyes, almost. So when you're stuck, definitely don't get stuck there. Definitely move on to something else.
I should also add, feel free to send this to someone sometimes, right? Sometimes someone else's perspective can help you see sort of where you're getting stuck and maybe provide more direction.
Okay, here's a really good question. What is your process for deciding what you're going to write about?
I think for me, that is going to be in part based off this larger research agenda I have, right? So I think you should have some sort of clear idea or direction. And I should, again, re-articulate, I'm talking from the position of junior faculty, right? And so like this might not be the same for graduate students. You may not have a research agenda just yet, but at least from the position of junior faculty, thinking about the larger sort of objectives of your work and thinking about sort of what do I already have like from my dissertation that I want to expand on and contribute to sort of this larger narrative, as well as what kind of new projects would I have that could speak to that narrative, right? From a different positioning, maybe. So in part, it's thinking about what you're going to write has to do with thinking about what you're going to research next, right? What phenomena is interesting, or yeah, what community do you want to study, right? I think that that part has to come first. And then those things turn into projects that turn into maybe talks that turn into papers.
Right, I totally agree. If anything, I would suggest that you move the clock earlier. You should have a research agenda by the time you go to grad school, possibly even before you get there. So you know you have a long-term plan and you can fulfill that plan. In graduate school, of course, dissertation, of course, at the beginning stage of your career and also the end stage of your career. So if anything, I would say plan earlier, as early as possible.
Okay. Here's someone writes in and says, thank you, Charles, Sharese, and also Audrey and Jill, who are our sign language interpreters. I wondered if you had any advice for how you approach the phase of writing when you feel confident enough in your work to begin sending it out. How do you decide you're ready, and then how do you proceed?
Yeah, I would say, again, my readiness relies a lot on my network, and just knowing that I've workshopped it a couple of times or it's been seen by a couple of different eyes before it sort of gets sent out, is important for me. Because that means like the ideas have already sort of been subjected to some scrutiny to some degree. And then I think eventually, and I think Charles maybe can speak to this, maybe as you get older and more mature in the process, you won't feel like you need to send it out as much. I think earlier in this phase, as I send it to people who have already published in a space that I want to publish in, because I think that those are the people then who can speak to sort of the process of what will come up maybe in the review process. So yeah, that's how I get ready. Is again, it's dependent on have these ideas been exposed to other people and been critiqued.
I agree. I think one thing to approach this without fear is to think about your writing and your research. It's really about ideas, not about you. And I welcome, when I work with students, undergraduates send me stuff. Sometimes high school kids send me stuff. It's all about ideas. It's not personal. So if you overcome that, I would say fear or really irrational one, I think you should be able to send your draft ideas to your advisors, to your friends. So you were wrong. So what? I mean, we're all wrong in the end. And so, the sooner you can get help, get advice in this process, the better, because you'll be able to avoid the mistakes early on.
Here's
so
another question.
Send it out anytime, right?
Yeah. So here's another question for both of you. Have you ever come up with a topic and thought it hasn't been talked about before, but later realized that it has been discussed similarly in the literature, and what did you do about it?
Yeah, that recently happened to me in a paper that I'm currently getting ready to submit. And I'm like, oh man, this person has kind of already said this. And so when that happens, you have to sit and think, am I saying the same exact thing as this person? And if I'm not, what about my ideas? Where do I sort of depart, right? And you can sort of practice writing it in a sentence, summarize their work. And then after you summarize that work, say how your work relates to what that summary is, right? So it might be such and such says X, and it might be I build on this discussion, or it might be such and such says X, but this assumes Y, which may be the thing that you disagree with. So I think it's gonna be thinking about how your work is positioned in relation to it. Is it different? Is it similar? Because sometimes, I mean, I don't think either is a deal breaker, right? I think sometimes having someone who's already said the idea that you had builds a precedent for you to say it again or say it with different data. So don't be afraid of having similar ideas as another person. In fact, I'm sure that a lot of us have similar ideas, and everything is not original, right? So yeah, think about how you are saying something similar or alike to what has already been established.
Right. Well, everybody has said everything, right? So it's important to realize, though, sometimes someone may have said something, but they didn't work it out, and it's just a offhand comment. It's important to acknowledge that, but sometimes it takes a lot more work than just to have an idea around. You have to work it out. So that's where you can really more carefully assess where your contribution lies relative to what people have said in the past. Of course, if really someone has done it, you should just move on, right? But I think there's lots of cases where someone has a germ of idea or even made some suggestions, but work wasn't done quite right, and that's your place to refine it and do it better.
Okay, great. Here's a question for Charles. Can you please elaborate on what you mean by building suspense as it applies to writing in linguistics?
Right. Building suspense in linguistics. I think first of all, you have to, when you write this, you have to have an ambitious idea, and that if you work out your vision, you should have some impact, possibly beyond the problem you are working on, right? And then you should go back to the prior scholarship to see what previous work has done. Very often, previous work may have been done in one area. Either the previous researchers did not see the connection to the other problems, or they didn't have the right solution. So by building suspense, I would say is to lay out the open problem, to see how the predecessors approach these problems, but without success. And then that's hopefully where you step in. So this is probably as good. I mean, of course, you have to be in a game of linguistics to appreciate the suspense, but that's something I found. And this is not something you discover right away. So the most recent book I wrote took 15 years to write, because I had an idea very early on, but these implications I didn't see until many, many years later. And I realized in the process was that even though I was working on a narrow problem at the time, its implication was broader. And so I was able to go broad and then go deep in those different areas and see why people are arguing over some topic, and then you see how your work can bring relevance to those debates, right? So this is what I would call by building a suspense. So, and it took me a very, very long time to write the first chapter of this book that came out at MIT Press a few years ago, where the first chapter is all about building suspense. And I found that to be effective, not only hopefully entice the reader, a bit, but also lay out the relevance of work to people who may not be reading this work, or who may be stumbling on this topic and happen to find leading them to see the relevance or the connection between your work and their world. And I think that might be what I mean by building suspense.
Okay, here's another question for either of you, I think. How soon should I aim to publish in my graduate program?
I would say as soon as you have the opportunity. And that's going to depend on a lot of things. I think to answer that question is to say, how soon am I going to get involved with the research project, right? Whether it be your own that you've, cultivated and done the methods for, or it be another professors who you're working with, right? And so early on in my career, I would say that, so some of my ideas that I'm working on now, I've been working on for a while, but the first big thing for me to hit, right, was the work that I did with John Rickford. And so we were able to publish that work together, but I think I needed the experience of publishing and working under or with another colleague or advisor before I sort of wanted to approach with some of my more independent ideas. And so for me, that was useful, right? Writing with someone more senior. And so when you're approaching sort of when should I be publishing, you should be thinking about what resources do I need, and am I publishing on my own, or am I also working on a joint project? And I think joint projects, I like to start there first, just to get more experience and knowledge from the co-authors who I think if you're younger, don't be afraid to like co-author with your advisors first before maybe you take your own leap. But everyone's department differs, so like ideally, your qualifying papers will be sort of the material you use to publish your own work. But if at the same time or before that, you can work on a project with someone else, I think that that's useful as well.
Right, I'd say also as early as possible. Very often, maybe especially early on, you don't have to write full-blown papers. It could be a conference abstract. You go there and give a lecture, you give a talk. You get an experience of telling a story, at least from my perspective, and that can help you when you're finally ready to write the full paper, right? So this process should be started as early as possible. Again, don't be afraid of being wrong.
Okay, are there any other questions? So for those of you in the audience, remember you can use the questions widget on your dashboard to ask them. And Charles and Sharese, do you have anything that you'd like to add to what you've said already or to the questions that have been asked? Okay. I don't see any other questions popping up, so I'll talk slowly for just a few minutes. But if I don't see any other questions, we'll go ahead and end the webinar shortly. So I'd like to thank both of our panelists for sharing their time and their expertise with us, and many thanks to those of you in the audience for taking the time out of your day, and thanks for the questions, which I thought were really good ones. We will have a recording of this webinar available no later than Monday, possibly by this afternoon, and I'll send around an email to let you all know. So we aren't having any more questions, but there are a couple of thank yous. Someone says, I had not thought of writing about my topic by telling a story. This is getting me to rethink my project. So you've already made a difference. That's great. Thanks again to all of you to Charles and Sharese for being panelists, and to all of you in the audience. And have a great weekend, everyone.
Thank you. Have a nice weekend.
So.
Thanks. Bye-bye now.